Have you ever noticed how, sometimes, life places us in situations that feel like a silent test of courage? A single no can ignite a spark that exposes everything hidden beneath the surface: fragile relationships, heavy silences, exclusions disguised as normality. That's exactly what happened to me. My own daughter, the one I gave years of care, support, and love, threw me out of the house where I thought I had a place, all because I refused to co-sign my grandson's bank loan. It was never about money, never about a signature on a piece of paper. It was about dignity. About understanding that love is not a financial contract, and that setting boundaries does not mean lack of affection. On the contrary, it means choosing yourself when you realize that the price of being accepted is losing your very soul. Maybe you've lived through something similar. Maybe you felt that lump in your throat when you noticed your presence was no longer welcome, when a home became nothing but a roof, when the eyes that once searched for you now turn away in silence. I know how deeply that hurts. But I also know that pain can be the beginning of a new clarity. This is a story about saying no, in that exact moment, discovering the courage to begin again. It's not just about family conflicts, but about waking up to something larger: autonomy, self-protection, and the certainty that it is still possible to build a new home filled with peace. So prepare yourself. What you're about to read is not just a personal account. It's also an invitation. An invitation to reflect on how far you go for others, and where respect for yourself truly begins. Because in the end, no one can erase a person who chooses to be reborn. And if stories like this touch your heart, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss new content that might inspire your own life. It was just an ordinary late afternoon, one of those when the smell of fresh coffee still filled the kitchen, when Zach came rushing in. His voice carried a mix of urgency and expectation, like someone convinced that one signature could solve his entire life. The request was clear: he wanted me to co-sign the loan he was trying to get from the bank. He spoke about plans, opportunities, a bright future. But behind every word there was an unspoken demand, almost as if my yes wasn't a choice but a duty. The expectation that a grandmother's love should automatically transform into financial backing hit me like a weight. It reminded me that blood ties often come with invisible contracts. As he spoke, my mind traveled back through the years I had spent dividing my time between raising the family, giving up my own dreams, and bearing heavy silences. They weren't just stories of sacrifice, they were stories of a devotion that so often went unrecognized. Being a cosigner wasn't just about signing papers, it was about putting at risk my security, my savings, my future. I knew that one yes could carry consequences far deeper than he imagined. And yet, I could see in his eyes the impatience of someone who doesn't understand limits. It felt like I was standing at a crossroads: on one side, the old expectation of always giving in; on the other, the rare and frightening courage to finally say no. The silence that followed my refusal was louder than any shout. Zach wasn't used to hearing no from me. He shifted in discomfort, like someone struck unexpectedly. "But Grandma, it's just a signature, nothing big," he insisted, trying to shrink the weight of the request. The problem was that for me, it wasn't just. It was everything. It was my name, my credibility, my independence on the line. How many people have carried debts that weren't theirs because they confused love with financial obligation? How many parents and grandparents had their lives turned upside down because they mistook sacrifice for responsibility? On the surface, my refusal looked simple. But at its core, it was a declaration of independence. I said no. I said it calmly, without raising my voice, without long justifications, but with the firm conviction of someone who knows that affection must never be confused with a bank guarantee. It wasn't just about denying a loan. It was about refusing to repeat a cycle of silent abuse where my goodwill was always exploited like currency. Looking into Zach's face, I said, "I love you, but not at the cost of my peace." Maybe he didn't hear the part about love, because anger quickly spread across his expression. He stormed out of the kitchen without a word, and within seconds Lydia came in, already knowing everything. Bad news spreads like fire when frustration is involved. Her voice was sharp, like vinegar poured into an open wound. "If you're not going to help your grandson, "Then don't expect to stay here much longer," she said, clutching a spatula as if it were a weapon. The sentence hit me like a blow. It wasn't just about the loan, it was about my value in that house. Or rather the lack of it. I realized, in her eyes, I was no longer family. I was just a burden to be discarded at the first sign of resistance. I stood still, holding a dish towel still warm from my hands. I didn't answer right away, not because I lacked words, but because I had learned that some silences speak louder than any argument. Silence can be resistance, it can be clarity, it can be a message that screams, "I will not bend." But inside, I confess, my heart trembled. Saying no may look small to someone on the outside, but for me it was a revolution. It was as though I had laid the first brick of an invisible wall between my dignity and the endless demands of others. The strange thing is, in that moment, I realized how life's roles can flip. I, who had spent decades offering unconditional support, now had to fight not to be reduced to a signature on a contract. Love isn't a loan. It isn't interest rates. It can't be turned into collateral for dreams that aren't mine. My refusal was also a lesson, though a bitter one. Protecting yourself isn't a lack of love, it's the greatest act of responsibility toward yourself. How many times have you said yes when every fiber of your being screamed no? How many times has the fear of upsetting someone outweighed the need to preserve your own soul? Later, when I sat in the living room after they both left, I felt the weight of decades pressing down on me. It wasn't only about Zach or Lydia. It was about all the times I had dimmed my light to fit in, all the times I accepted crumbs of affection as though they were feasts, all the times I allowed myself to be treated as a given. That no showed me something new. It is never too late to draw boundaries. Even at 76, I could still choose myself. And that choice, painful as it was the seed of something greater that I couldn't yet see. That night, as I closed my bedroom door, I understood that my refusal had cracked open the everyday routine. What once felt like normal life was now heavy with tension. I knew consequences were coming: heavier silences, sidelong glances, subtle acts of exclusion. And yet, inside me, something else was blooming, a quiet, fragile peace that came from having defended my autonomy. It was as if, in saying no to the loan, I had finally said yes to myself. And that, despite everything, was a beginning. The next morning after the confrontation, the house looked the same, but the air was different. Silence ruled the hallways like an unwanted guest. It wasn't the peaceful kind of silence of a lazy Sunday morning, it was a heavy, suffocating silence that presses against your chest, exposing all the words left unsaid. Lydia passed by me without a glance, the only sound being her cup clinking against the saucer. Zach avoided me too, and where there used to be conversations, there were only hurried footsteps and doors slamming shut. That's when I realized sometimes, not answering is more powerful than any argument. In that house, silence had turned into a weapon. Sitting in the armchair in the living room, I remembered an old saying: when there are no arguments left to sustain the truth, silence becomes the clearest form of resistance. I could have shouted, demanded respect, confronted every one of Lydia's words. But I chose not to feed the fire. Silence, for me, was a decision. And that decision brought clarity. Each time I kept quiet, it wasn't submission, it was a silent affirmation that I would not give in. That, even in the exclusion they tried to impose, my dignity would not be negotiated in exchange for a little false peace. But silence also hurts. At night, lying in bed, I could hear the sounds from the kitchen, and new conversations were happening without me. They laughed, made plans, shared secrets. I was the shadow in the room next door, invisible. It's a kind of exclusion that doesn't shout, but eats you alive from within. Each laugh was a reminder you don't belong here anymore. This slow erasure was perhaps the cruelest rejection of all, not an immediate expulsion, but the transformation of your existence into invisibility. Still, I began to notice that silence held its own kind of power. It forced me to look inward, to face the pains I had buried for decades. How many times in my life had I been silenced? How many times had I swallowed words to keep the peace, to preserve a fragile harmony? The silence in that house was only an echo of all the other silences I had allowed. But now, at 76, that echo sounded different. It was uncomfortable, yes, but it was also revealing. It told me clearly that I no longer had space to shrink myself down. I remembered a line from Clarice Lispector: "The silence is such that even speaking feels exhausting." And that was exactly how I felt. Speaking no longer mattered. Words would only be twisted, ridiculed, turned against me. So I chose to withdraw, but in a conscious way, as a shield. That silence wasn't empty, it was full of decisions. In those quiet hours, I decided I would no longer finance rejection. I would no longer offer explanations. I would no longer justify choices that belonged only to me. It was the beginning of an internal revolution, and I could feel its strength growing. During that time, I found refuge in small rituals. A warm cup of tea I brewed just for myself. A book left open on the table. A flower I picked from the garden. While they carried on with their noisy conversations, I quietly rebuilt myself. And in some strange way, I began to see this exclusion as a disguised gift. Because by pushing me to the margins, they gave me the chance to finally see myself clearly. That clarity slowly became the foundation I had been missing. Silence, in the end, taught me that I didn't need to fight for places that no longer wanted me. It showed me that real strength isn't in shouting, but in choosing where to spend your energy. Every morning I woke up and chose not to react. I was unknowingly training my courage for something bigger. The silence was only a prelude to the decision that would eventually come: the decision to leave. Because once you truly understand that you don't belong, the next step is to decide where you do. And so, little by little, that silence stopped being only pain. It became a warning, a compass. It whispered, "This is no longer your place." And as painful as it was to hear that message without words, I knew it was the truth. It wasn't about giving up on family, it was about realizing that love should never cost your peace. In that heavy quiet, which many might mistake for defeat, I discovered the courage to prepare myself for what was to come: the seed of a new beginning. The first changes were almost imperceptible. A light bulb in my room burned out and no one offered to replace it. A power outlet was switched off by accident, they claimed, leaving me unable to charge my phone overnight. Small things, subtle things, but filled with meaning. It was as if every little detail was another way of saying, "You are no longer a priority here." Slowly, the house that once sheltered me began to feel like hostile ground. There were no open confrontations, only silent signals of exclusion that hurt even more because they came disguised as coincidences. I remember one night, when I walked into the kitchen to make tea, only to find the electric kettle gone. I asked casually where it was, and Lydia answered with a cold smile, "We thought it was time to clear some space." Space for what? Space for whom? It felt as though even the simplest objects that belonged to me were now treated as nuisances. That's when I understood erasure doesn't happen all at once. It comes in small doses, in quiet acts of retaliation that gradually eat away at your presence until you become almost nothing. It's strange how the heart knows before the mind does. I tried to convince myself they were coincidences, but deep down I knew there was intent. Each act of exclusion was deliberate, even if no one would admit it. And that slow, creeping erasure was more cruel than any open fight. Because when someone yells, you can answer back. But when someone ignores you, erases you in silence, the fight is against an invisible enemy. That's when I started observing the house with new eyes. What once seemed like routine was now heavy with hidden messages. The glass I always used that suddenly disappeared, the tablecloth removed before I could sit down, the remote control that was never where I left it. Everything communicated the same message: you are not welcome. This silent language made it painfully clear that the home no longer belonged to me. It was as though the house itself was expelling my soul long before my body was gone. That realization led me to reflect on the meaning of belonging. Belonging is not just about having a roof over your head. It's being part of the conversations, being remembered in decisions, being included in simple gestures. When those things vanish, a roof is nothing but cover, and a house is just walls. I was inside the structure, but spiritually, I had already been evicted. That realization hurt deeply, but it also brought clarity. I needed to find a place where I wasn't merely tolerated, but truly welcomed. Despite the pain, I began turning every small act of retaliation into fuel for my independence. If the kettle was gone, I boiled water on the stove like I used to long ago. If outlets were turned off, I adjusted my routine to charge my phone at different times. These small adjustments reminded me that, despite their attempts to erase me, I still had resources inside myself. With each exclusion, I responded with an act of self-preservation. It wasn't just survival, it was silent resistance. In time, I realized these small acts of retaliation said more about them than about me. They revealed their inability to handle a no, their immaturity in turning frustration into vengeance. And that realization brought me an odd serenity. Because in the end, I could finally see that I wasn't the problem. I was only the mirror reflecting their own fragilities back at them. So every burned-out light bulb, every missing kettle, every heavy silence stopped being just wounds. They became signs. Signs that it was time to plan my next step. The house was trying to erase me, but inside, a fire was starting to burn. And that fire had a name: courage. The most painful moment wasn't Lydia's harsh sentence, nor the objects quietly taken away. It was the clear, almost physical awareness that I no longer belonged there. It's hard to explain how the heart just knows when it stops being part of a place. You still walk down the same hallways, still sit at the same table, but the air around you grows heavy and distant. It's like being a stranger inside a space you helped build. And that sense of not belonging, it's a kind of living death, because it drains the joy even from the smallest gestures. I remember one dinner where everyone was talking excitedly about vacation plans. Laughter filled the room, stories bounced back and forth, knowing glances were exchanged. I sat at the end of the table, and not once did my name come up in the conversation. I felt transparent, like my presence no longer mattered. It cuts deep when you realize you're not even remembered in the stories you helped create. At moments like that, invisibility weighs heavier than any hostile word. Not belonging isn't just about being ignored. It's also the discomfort you feel in every small action. Reaching for a glass in the cupboard and sensing you're no longer welcome to use it. Sitting on the couch and catching quick, disapproving glances, as if you were taking up space you shouldn't. Every detail turns into a reminder that you no longer fit into the picture. The house had become a stage, and I had been demoted from main character to unwanted extra. During this time, I began reflecting on the difference between being somewhere and truly belonging there. Being is physical, you can exist in any space, even one where you're not accepted. Belonging is emotional, it's when your absence is noticed and your presence is celebrated. Physically, I was still there. But spiritually, there was no room left for me. That awareness was bitter, but also freeing. Because once you understand you don't belong, you realize you're free to seek a place where you do. That awareness stirred old memories. How many times in my life had I felt the same, but ignored it? How many times did I accept secondary roles just to keep the peace? Maybe this pattern had always been there, only more subtle. But now it stood right in front of me, unmasked, undeniable. And I knew I couldn't keep pretending. Because living without belonging is like trying to breathe without air, a painful, pointless survival. To survive those days, I created small internal refuges. I read fragments of books that reminded me of who I was beyond those walls. One passage from Martha Medeiros marked me deeply. Belonging is having a place to return to, even if you never go. I no longer had a place to return to there, but I could build a new one. That thought began to grow slowly, like a seed planted in dry ground. And the more the exclusion around me grew, the more I nurtured that silent seed. It's strange how the absence of belonging can also spark courage. When you realize you've got nothing left to lose in a place, you suddenly discover you can dare to dream of new ones. In a way, I was already outside, even while living inside. And that emotional distance opened the door to something I once thought impossible, imagining a life of my own, free from demands, free from erasure. So the pain of not belonging stopped being just suffering. It became an invisible push, a quiet force propelling me toward change. I didn't yet know how or when, but I knew one thing for certain: I would no longer stay in a place where my soul no longer fit. It was on an ordinary morning, while I was making my bed, that the thought came to me like a persistent whisper: you could leave. Just like that. No announcement, no build-up. As if my own conscience had finally gathered the courage to speak out loud the truth that had been quietly living in my heart. That idea, which had once seemed unthinkable, began to echo through every movement. Folding the sheets, walking past the kitchen door, looking out the window, everything seemed to remind me maybe it was time to go. At first, I tried to dismiss the thought. After all, who decides to start over at 76? I asked myself if it wasn't too late, if it wasn't madness. But day by day, the feeling of not belonging only strengthened the urgency of the decision. What had once seemed crazy now looked like the only healthy choice. Staying in a place without welcome was the real risk, not the opposite. I understood then age is not an obstacle to freedom. In fact, it's an argument in its favor. Because the less time you have, the more precious peace becomes. That seed of a decision sprouted in ordinary moments. As I brewed my tea, I thought, what if I could drink it in a home that was mine alone, in silence, without fearing sideways glances? As I opened a book, I wondered, what if I could read without interruption, without feeling like I was taking up too much space? Those daydreams became rehearsals for a life I didn't yet have, but was beginning to picture. It was as though every little fantasy watered that seed until it grew roots deep inside me. The most surprising thing was realizing that this decision wasn't born out of anger, but out of clarity. I didn't want to leave to punish anyone, I wanted to leave to protect myself. It wasn't escape, it was self-care. How many times do we confuse love with obligation and keep ourselves in places that no longer do us good? Once I understood that, a strange calm settled over me. The courage to leave stopped being a distant thought and began to feel like a real plan. Of course, there was fear. What would it be like to live alone after so long? How would I handle the bills, the responsibilities, the silence of a house by myself? Those questions came, but instead of paralyzing me, they challenged me. It was as if life itself were asking, do you trust yourself? And for the first time in a long while, I wanted to answer, yes. Because autonomy isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to keep walking, fear and all. I remembered stories of other women who had started over late in life. A neighbor who, at 80, decided to travel the country by train. A distant cousin who, after becoming a widow, went back to school. Their examples inspired me, showing me that it's never too late to choose a new path. Time may limit possibilities, but it doesn't erase the ability to change. If anything, it gives urgency to what truly matters. With that in mind, I began jotting down ideas in an old notebook. I wrote lists: possible places to live, monthly expenses, small goals. Nothing definitive, but it was the first concrete step toward a different life. As I wrote those words, I felt as though I was signing a contract with myself, a contract of autonomy. For the first time in many years, I could see myself again in the role of protagonist of my own story. And so, the seed of that decision grew stronger. It was no longer just a whisper, it was a firm voice inside me. A voice that said, you deserve more. You deserve peace. You deserve a home where love isn't conditional on contracts. That awareness was what kept me standing in the face of the slow erasure I was enduring. Because even as they tried to erase me there, I was already beginning to light myself up somewhere else. The day I decided to go to the bank looked ordinary to anyone else, but for me it was a silent landmark of courage. I walked slowly down the streets, the cold wind brushing my face, and each step felt heavy as though I were carrying not only my body but also years of hesitation and silence. Entering that building, with its glass doors and the familiar smell of paper and coffee, felt like crossing a threshold. I wasn't there to fulfill anyone else's request. I was there for myself. The first concrete step toward autonomy began right there, in the simple decision to check my own savings. While waiting in line, I observed people around me, anxious faces chasing loans, credit, negotiations, debts. But I was there with a different purpose, to confirm that I still had something that belonged only to me. When the clerk called me forward, I gave a small smile, like someone holding on to a quiet secret. I asked for the full printout of my accounts. Every number on that paper wasn't just financial value, it was proof that despite all my sacrifices, I had managed to preserve a part of myself. It wasn't much, but it was enough to reignite the hope that starting over was still possible. When I left the bank, I folded the printout carefully, almost like it was a ticket to freedom. I walked to a nearby square and sat down on a wooden bench. There, alone, I took a deep breath and felt a lightness I hadn't felt in years. Having financial independence, even modest, meant having the power to choose. And the power to choose is the very essence of freedom. In that moment, I realized I didn't need to beg for space where I wasn't wanted. I could create my own. That first step, though simple, gave me a sense of victory that no external approval could ever provide. It was like recovering a part of my identity that had been erased over the years. Exclusion often robs us not only of the present but of faith in the future. And that bank statement, as trivial as it might have looked, was proof that I still had the power to decide the course of my life. Of course, fear kept lingering around. I would ask myself, what if the money isn't enough? What if I can't adjust to living alone? But then I realized fear will always be there, whether you're trapped inside a house that doesn't want you, or standing at the edge of a new beginning. The difference is this: in the first case, fear paralyzes you; in the second, it propels you forward. And I would rather be pushed by fear than remain frozen in exclusion. It was in that moment that I understood the power of small steps. Nobody rebuilds a life all at once. You don't need to have all the answers, but you do need to take the first movement. Going to the bank, checking my savings, planning my expenses, those practical actions became steps on a staircase that seemed endless, but could only be climbed one step at a time. Back home, I slipped the bank statement into a notebook, between pages that once held nothing but scattered recipes and reminders. It was symbolic. In the middle of ordinary routines, a project of freedom was beginning to take shape. Every number written there was a brick for the foundation of a new home. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt ready to look at the future with clarity. The first concrete step wasn't just going to the bank. It was believing that I could still write a new story. It was realizing that even after years of slow erasure, the flame of autonomy still burned within me. And that flame, now fed by courage, was beginning to illuminate the path that would lead me to the next chapter, the encounter with an opportunity that would change everything. It was on a rainy afternoon that the opportunity appeared before me, almost like an unexpected gift from destiny. I was walking back from the market, holding an umbrella that kept flipping inside out in the wind, when my eyes caught a modest sign on the front of a simple building for rent. It was on Linwood Avenue, a street I had always admired for its calm. Aligned trees, birds singing, neighbors who still seemed to nurture the habit of greeting each other with a smile. I stopped in front of the iron gate and, just for a moment, felt a warmth in my chest, as if the place itself were calling me. The realtor, a kind middle-aged woman, opened the apartment door. She seemed to understand what I was feeling just by the look in my eyes. The space was small, nothing luxurious, but there was something about it that captured me instantly: silence and peace. The pale walls, the worn wooden floor, the window that allowed the afternoon light to stream in without asking permission. I pictured myself preparing tea in that modest kitchen, reading my books in the sunlit living room, watering a small plant on the balcony. It was as if every corner of the apartment whispered, "Here, you can begin again." As I walked through the rooms, I remembered the recent nights when exclusion had left me gasping for air. The contrast was overwhelming. Here, there were no sideways glances, no unplugged lamps, no laughter that ignored me. Here, there was room to exist fully. It felt as though the universe had placed me before a clear choice: stay in the shadows or step into the light. And for the first time in a long time, I felt worthy of that light. The realtor spoke of prices, contracts, documents. I listened carefully, but inside me another music was playing, louder than her words, the melody of freedom. I thought of how many times people had told me that starting over at my age was impossible. Yet here was the proof that it wasn't. I didn't need a mansion. I didn't need luxury. All I needed was a space that was mine, where each object carried the weight of my choice rather than the burden of someone else's imposition. As I ran my hand along the bedroom wall, almost as if caressing a future still invisible, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years: belonging. There was no need to decorate, no need to fill it with expensive furniture. Just imagining my life there was enough to transform that space into a home. And that reminded me of a simple truth: it's not the size of the house that matters, but the size of the peace it holds. In that instant, I decided I would do whatever it took to make that little apartment my refuge. Even if it meant tightening my budget, even if it meant giving up certain comforts. Dignity has no price, and I could not waste the chance destiny was offering me. The thought of signing a contract in my own name, after years of being invisible in other people's houses, filled me with strength. When I stepped back outside, the rain had stopped and a faint rainbow appeared between the clouds. I took it as a sign, a silent gesture from the universe that I was on the right path. Because sometimes signs don't come in words or certainties, but in subtle details that only the heart can recognize. And my heart knew this apartment was the opportunity one had been waiting for. Back at home, I slipped the realtor's card into the same notebook where I had placed my bank statement. Now, it wasn't just numbers on a page. It was plans, dreams, possibilities. And for the first time in many years, I had something real to look forward to, a place of my own. It didn't take long for Zach to notice that something was changing. My steps were firmer, my voice clearer. He grew uneasy with my calm, as if sensing that his influence no longer controlled me. One ordinary afternoon, while he sat at the table scrolling through his phone, I decided to tell him the truth. I looked into his eyes and said, "Zach, I found an apartment." The silence that followed was heavy with disbelief. He dropped his phone, leaned forward, and snapped, "You're doing this just because you wouldn't help me, aren't you? You're trying to punish me." I took a deep breath before answering. There was no anger in me, only clarity. "No, Zach. This isn't about you. It's about me." I needed to understand that love is not a contract, and care does not mean submission. I will not mortgage my peace to solve problems that aren't mine. He laughed, but it was a nervous laugh, tinged with irony. "You always said family comes first. And now you're going to turn your back on me?" His words stung, but I refused to let them paralyze me. Because deep down, I knew I wasn't turning my back on him. I was turning my back on a cycle of dependence and manipulation. He raised his voice, trying to sway me with arguments laced with guilt and emotional blackmail. He spoke of opportunities he'd lose, of how I'd be remembered as the grandmother who didn't help. Each phrase was a trap, an attempt to twist my no into selfishness. But I no longer let myself be caught in those nets. I replied firmly, "I would rather you see me as someone who set limits than as someone who lost herself trying to please everyone else." His silence was immediate, but this time it wasn't a weapon, it was shock. That was when I realized just how much I had grown. Before, I would have backed down, softened the edges, found a way to minimize the conflict. But now, my boundaries were clear. And that clarity was liberating. I didn't need to scream, didn't need to convince. All I had to do was hold my ground with serenity. His anger no longer had power over me. It was like watching a storm rage outside while knowing the sun was still shining beyond the clouds. Zach made one last appeal, invoking love. "If you really loved me, you would have done this for me." That was when I smiled, sad, but resolute. "Love isn't a contract, Zach. Love is a choice. And my choice now is to protect myself. If your love depends on a signature, then it isn't love, it's interest." He averted his eyes, unable to face the truth echoing in my words. I knew that, in that moment, He was being forced to confront something he had never wanted to see, that family bonds cannot be sustained by exploitation. That conversation was a turning point. Not because he understood immediately, but because I finally did. I understood that saying no did not make me less of a mother or less of a grandmother. On the contrary, it made me more whole, more honest with myself. The courage to stand before him was the final line in a story of silences and erasures. From that day on, there was no going back. I was ready to leave. That night, when I returned to my room, I didn't feel sadness, but an unexpected peace. It was as if a massive weight had been lifted from my shoulders. The clarity that I no longer needed to justify my decisions gave me a sense of freedom I had never known. From that moment forward, it was no longer a matter of if I would leave. It was only a matter of when. And that when was drawing nearer with every day. Because by affirming to Zach that love is not a contract, I reaffirmed to myself that dignity is not negotiable. And that certainty would be the fuel that carried me to the next step, the courage to leave. On the day I began packing my things, I realized that courage isn't the absence of fear, it's the decision to keep going in spite of it. Every object I placed inside the boxes carried memories, stories, fragments of an entire life. Plates I had used for family dinners, books that kept me company on sleepless nights, photographs holding smiles that had long faded. As I folded clothes and sorted documents, tears streamed down my face, but they weren't just tears of sorrow, they were tears of release. It felt as though I wasn't just emptying the room, but also shedding the weight of years spent in silence. Signing the lease for the apartment was an act of quiet solemnity. The pen felt heavier than usual, as if every stroke were a declaration of autonomy. The realtor spoke of dates, deposits, keys. I barely heard her. In my mind, only one phrase repeated: this space is mine. It wasn't about bricks or walls, but about belonging. For the first time in so long, I was choosing a home without asking permission, without explaining myself. It was the materialization of the courage I had been cultivating in silence. When the key dropped into my hand, a shiver ran through me. It was just a simple key, yet to me it symbolized rebirth. How many times had I thought there would be no new doors left for me to open? How many times had I believed my destiny was only to wait? Yet there I was, with an entire future locked inside a door that now belonged to me. The metallic click of the key was music to my ears, the sound of freedom. On moving day, I walked out the front door of the old house without looking back. I didn't want to carry resentment, only lessons. Lydia didn't come to say goodbye. Zach locked himself in his room. It was a silent farewell, but a necessary one. I loaded the boxes into the rented car and took a deep breath. This wasn't just a physical move, it was the end of a cycle of exclusion. Crossing that gate meant leaving behind not only an address, but also the identity of someone who had dimmed herself just to fit in. The drive to Linwood Avenue was short, but inside me it felt like a journey of decades. Each turn of the street peeled away another layer of fear. When the car finally stopped in front of the building, my heart raced not with anxiety, but with anticipation. I didn't know exactly what life would be like from now on, but I knew it would be mine. And that alone was enough to fill my chest with strength. Stepping into the empty apartment, I placed the boxes on the floor and stood still for a few moments, taking it all in. The silence here was different from the silence of the old house. Here, silence wasn't exclusion. It was space, it was promise, it was renewal. I felt embraced by the emptiness, as if each wall whispered, here, you can be whole. I closed my eyes and gave thanks in silence. The courage to leave had brought me here, and now it was up to me to fill this space with life. In the following days, I arranged everything with care. I chose light curtains for the living room, bought fresh flowers for the table, placed my books on a small shelf. Each gesture became a ritual of reconstruction. It didn't matter that the furniture was simple because everything there had been chosen by me. And that autonomy transformed the apartment into something sacred. I discovered that dignity lives in the small, everyday choices, and that the courage to leave had been the first step toward reclaiming it. In that new home, I realized that I hadn't just gained freedom, I had also found peace. Peace to wake without fear. Peace to choose my own rhythm. Peace to belong to myself once more. And as I prepared my first cup of tea in the new kitchen, I smiled and thought it was hard, but I did it. The courage to leave had turned into the courage to truly live. The first nights in the new apartment were unlike anything I had ever experienced. The silence no longer hurt, instead, it soothed me, almost therapeutic. I would sit on the little balcony with a warm cup of tea in my hands and watch the streetlights below. There were no disapproving looks, no unplugged outlets, no sharp words pushing me out. There was only the calm of a space I could finally call my own. I discovered that rebuilding an identity begins in these small moments, when you recognize yourself again in the reflection of your daily life. I bought fresh flowers and placed them in a glass vase on the living room table. A simple gesture, yet full of meaning. For years, I had grown used to living in spaces that didn't reflect who I was, only what others wanted from me. Now, every detail of the apartment was chosen by me for me. The flowers brightened not only the room but also my spirit. It was as if I were saying to myself, "You are blooming again." That symbolism gave even more strength to my process of rebirth. I also rediscovered companionship in books. I opened volumes that had been packed away for decades. I reread Clarice Lispector and felt as though her words were speaking directly to my heart. I picked up Think and Grow Rich by Napoleon Hill, which reminded me of the power of mindset to transform reality. Each page I turned was like another step in rebuilding who I was. And I realized that when we allow ourselves to learn again, life always offers us new lenses to see through. Another ritual I created was writing daily in a notebook I called my Freedom Journal. In it, I recorded achievements, fears, dreams, and even the little details like the joy of cooking something just for myself. As I wrote, I realized that my inner voice, so often silenced, was finally being heard. Rebuilding my identity also meant naming my emotions without fear of judgment. It was like stitching together loose fragments of myself into a new quilt, more colorful, stronger, more complete. I also discovered the joy of welcoming visitors who truly brought me joy. One elderly neighbor, Mrs. Margaret, brought me a welcome cake. We chatted on the balcony as if we had been friends for years. Unlike what I had lived before, here there were no hidden debts, no demands, only genuine kindness. I understood then that healthy relationships are those where the other's presence is a celebration, not a burden. Those encounters reminded me that I could still form true bonds as long as I first formed one with myself. Each morning, I created small rituals to nurture my new life. I lit a scented candle, did gentle stretches, and played old songs that had always given me strength. These habits, simple yet intentional, reminded me that dignity also lives in routine. When you consciously choose the gestures of your day, you're not just shaping your environment, you're reshaping your identity. And that reconstruction is a kind of daily rebirth. Of course, there were days of doubt. I asked myself if I had made the right decision, if perhaps it would have been easier to stay in the old house out of convenience. But all it took was looking around and feeling the peace of my new space to silence those voices. Rebuilding identity doesn't mean erasing scars, it means learning to live with them without letting them define who you are. And I was learning, day by day, that my identity was far greater than the roles others had tried to impose on me. Over time, I realized that the reconstruction wasn't happening only inside the apartment. It showed in the way I walked down the street, in how I spoke to strangers, in how I looked at myself in the mirror. The woman who once saw herself faded away now saw dignity in her own reflection. And that dignity had become my most precious treasure. Rebuilding my identity was, in truth, reclaiming the certainty that I had always been enough and that now, finally, I believed it. Zach was the first to show up. He rang the bell one quiet afternoon and stepped inside, looking around as if trying to understand how I had managed to move on without him. He sat on the sofa and whispered, "I never imagined you'd have the courage to leave." His voice carried both surprise and regret. I answered calmly, "Zach, love is not a debt. I can be present, but I cannot be exploited." He didn't argue. He simply lowered his eyes, and in that silent gesture I knew that, even if he didn't say it aloud, he was beginning to reflect. Lydia came days later. Unlike Zach, her expression was hard, almost defiant. Looking around at my simple living room, she said, "So this is where you chose to hide?" I took a deep breath and replied, "I'm not hiding, Lydia. I'm living. For the first time in a long time, I am at peace." The silence that followed was heavier than any argument. It was as if, faced with my firmness, she had no choice but to confront her own decisions. Those late encounters didn't bring instant reconciliation, but they opened space for a new kind of relationship-rooted independency, more marked by respect. I didn't need to raise my voice or demand apologies. It was enough to hold the boundaries I had set. And in that clarity I realized when one person changes, everyone around them is forced to reposition themselves. In this new home, silence stopped being a weapon and became healing. Walking through the small rooms, lighting a candle, preparing my own simple act reminded me that I finally belonged to myself. The quiet evenings on the balcony gave me back something I thought. The quiet evenings on the balcony gave me back something I thought I had lost forever: dignity. I discovered that true rebirth doesn't come from grand achievements, but from everyday choices. Saying no without guilt. Writing in my journal. Caring for a plant. Allowing myself to laugh again. Small acts that, when added together, rebuilt my identity. It was like stitching a quilt from scraps, each piece of pain transformed into a patch of wisdom, each memory of exclusion reworked into strength. Over time, I came to understand that peace is not a luxury, it is a right. And that it is never too late to start over. At 76, I realized that there were still chapters left to be written, that blossoming has no age. My rebirth did not erase scars, but it taught me to wear them as marks of resilience. Today, I can say with certainty that I didn't just survive, I was reborn, and in freedom, I found the space to be whole again. The story you have just followed is not only about a grandmother who said no to a risky request. It is about courage, dignity, and the difficult yet liberating decision to finally put yourself first after a lifetime of renunciations. Every step of this journey, from refusing to co-sign a loan to moving into a modest apartment on Linwood Avenue, was marked by pain, but also by a silent transformation that could no longer be ignored. Because, deep down, all of us face a moment where we must choose between remaining invisible or rising to write a new chapter. That choice, however, is never easy. Saying no when the world expects only yes is like breaking an invisible contract. It demands strength to endure the disapproving looks, the cutting words, the heavy silence of exclusion. But it also reveals a fundamental truth: true love is not measured by how many times you erase yourself, but by the courage to protect your own essence. When this grandmother said no to her grandson, she wasn't rejecting her family, she was rejecting the role of martyr that had been forced upon her. And here lies the central lesson: it is never too late to begin again. At 76, she proved that age is not synonymous with resignation. How many people believe they've run out of time, that they no longer have the strength to create something new? This story shows the opposite. The courage to leave, even after decades, is living proof that life can bloom in any season. It doesn't matter if you are in the summer of youth or the autumn of maturity, there is always the possibility of rebirth. But perhaps the most moving point of this journey is the realization that peace is not a luxury. For years, she lived surrounded by painful silences, subtle retaliations, and slow erasures. And yet, when she found her new home, she discovered that true wealth was in the simple rituals: preparing her tea, opening a book, writing in a journal. It is in these everyday details that dignity finds shelter. And it is here that we understand freedom is not about great victories, but about being able to choose where and how we want to live. Now, I want to speak directly to you, the one following this story. Maybe you too have felt the pain of not belonging. Maybe you've been pushed aside in a space where you believed you had a place. Maybe you stayed silent to keep the peace, even though it cost you your voice. If this narrative echoes in your heart, know this: it is not just fiction, it is a mirror of many lives. It may be your mirror. And this is why I invite you now subscribe to this channel. Yes, be part of a community that believes in the power of stories like this one, stories that inspire, provoke reflection, and remind us that it is never too late to change. Turn on notifications, like, and share this video. Because the more people who hear these words, the more women and men too will find the courage to draw their own boundaries. Perhaps your decision to click that button today will be the beginning of your own rebirth. The truth is, we all have the right to say enough. We all have the right to refuse roles that diminish us and to claim a space where we can flourish. This grandmother found her freedom in a small apartment, but the place itself doesn't matter. It could be a house, a project, a new habit, or even a simple but firm no. What matters is that at some point, you too can choose yourself. And when that choice is made, something changes forever. You begin to walk lighter, to laugh more authentically, to sleep peacefully knowing you haven't betrayed yourself. That is true rebirth, when you realize you don't need anyone's approval to exist, because you already carry within you the value you had been searching for in others. And so, the story that began with exclusion and pain closes with freedom and peace. Not because life became perfect, but because the protagonist understood that perfection was never the goal. What was always needed and what will always remain was dignity. And that, no one can ever take away from her again.